To all my brothers and sisters across Africa, and to those watching from afar who still believe in dignity, in land, and in legacy, I greet you with respect, and I wish you strength today. Because what we are about to witness is not just a story, it is a turning point. What if I told you that in the heart of the Sahel, where the earth has cracked for generations, a revolution has begun? Not with soldiers marching, not with weapons raised, but with water. In Burkina Faso, there was a time, not long ago, when the land itself seemed to betray its people. The rains came late, or not at all. Fields that once fed families turned into dust. And across villages, fathers stood silently, staring at empty soil, knowing there was nothing left to give their children. One of them is Issa. Issa is a farmer from the Bama Plains, a man whose hands carry the history of his land. For years, he woke before sunrise, not to farm, but to wait. Wait for clouds. Wait for rain. Wait for mercy. And when that mercy did not come, everything fell apart. His crops failed. His income vanished. And slowly, his dignity began to slip away. Because when a man cannot feed his family, it is not just hunger he feels. It is something deeper, something heavier. Now imagine that story, repeated across an entire nation. This was Burkina Faso, a country rich in land, but trapped by water. A nation full of strength, but forced into dependence. But then, something changed. A new idea began to rise, not from foreign offices, not from distant institutions, but from within the soil itself. What if water could be controlled? What if the people no longer had to wait? What if the land could live again? Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, that question became action, and that action became a revolution. But here is the truth no one is asking. Can water really restore a nation's dignity? Or will this bold gamble risk everything Burkina Faso has left? Stay with me, because what happens next may change how we understand power forever. The moment Burkina Faso stopped waiting for rain, everything began to change. Because waiting is not a strategy, and hope alone does not grow food. So instead of looking to the sky, the nation turned to the ground. Deep beneath the dry soil, there was always something waiting. Water. Not gone. Not lost. Just uncontrolled. And that became the center of a bold new vision. Not aid. Not promises. But action. From the Gulu-Ray Basin, something extraordinary began to unfold. Water was no longer left to chance. It was captured, directed, and guided with intention. Channels were carved into the earth, not as simple irrigation lines, but as lifelines. Long stretches of canal began to cut through land that had been forgotten for decades. And at the heart of this transformation stood Bama. Bama was not chosen because it was easy. Bama was chosen because it was broken. For years, people had looked at that land and seen failure. Cracked soil, abandoned fields, a place where investment meant risk, and hope meant disappointment. But for this revolution, Bama became something else. A test, a statement, a promise. Because if water could bring Bama back to life, then nothing in Burkina Faso would be impossible. Issa remembers the first time he saw the water arrive. Not rain from the sky, but a steady flow, moving across the land like something alive. At first, people did not celebrate. They watched, quietly, carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. But it didn't. Day after day, the water kept coming, and slowly, the land responded. Fields that had been dry for years began to soften. Seeds that once failed began to grow. Green returned to places where only dust had lived. Today, over 260 hectares of rice fields have been restored. Another 70 hectares are producing vegetables again, and more land is already being prepared for expansion. But numbers alone do not tell the story, because what is happening here is not just agricultural recovery. It is something far deeper. For the first time in years, farmers like Issa are not planting in fear. They are planting with certainty. They are no longer asking, "Will the rain come?" They are asking, "How much can we grow?" And that question changes everything. Because control over water is control over time, control over planning, control over life, and perhaps most importantly, control over dignity. This project was not built with foreign consultants, not funded by distant institutions, not designed to serve outside interests. It was built by the hands of the people, for the survival of the people. And that is what makes it revolutionary. Because, for generations, development came from outside. Decisions were made elsewhere. Solutions were imported. But this time, the answer came from within. From the land. From the need. From the will to survive, without asking permission. This is no longer just irrigation. This is independence, flowing through canals. But revolutions like this do not happen without pressure, because when a nation begins to stand on its own, it changes the balance. And when the balance changes, resistance follows. So the question is no longer whether water can transform Burkina Faso. The question is, what forces will rise when a nation no longer needs to depend? Stay with me, because what happens next will push this revolution to its breaking point. At first, many people thought this was just another project, another plan, another promise, another attempt that would fade with time. But something different began to happen. The water did not stop. The fields did not fail. And the people began to believe again. And when people start believing, that is when a revolution becomes real. Because this was never just about irrigation. It was about breaking a cycle that had lasted for generations. For years, hunger had quietly shaped the destiny of Burkina Faso. Not always through famine, not always through headlines, but through dependence. When the harvest failed, help came from outside. When food ran low, aid arrived with conditions. And slowly, without anyone saying it out loud, survival became tied to waiting. Waiting for shipments, waiting for support, waiting for permission. But now, something had changed. As water began to flow through the canals of Bama, it carried more than life to the soil. It carried a message that said, we can feed ourselves. And that message is powerful. Because once a nation begins to feed itself, it begins to think differently. It begins to stand differently. It begins to decide differently. Issa felt it before he could explain it. One evening, standing in his field, watching the reflection of water move between rows of young rice plants, he said something simple. For the first time, I am not afraid of next season. Think about that. Not fear, not uncertainty, not survival, but confidence. And when that confidence spreads from one farmer to one village to an entire region, it becomes something unstoppable. But every transformation carries tension. Because as Burkina Faso moved closer to self-reliance, the stakes grew higher. This was no longer just about growing crops. This was about rewriting a system where scarcity created control, a system where dependence created influence, a system where hunger could be used quietly, effectively. And now, that system was being challenged, not with confrontation, but with capability. Water became the quiet force behind that challenge. No speeches, no declarations, just results. Green fields where there was once dust. Markets slowly filling with local harvests. Families beginning to plan instead of fear. But change like this does not happen without pressure. Because when a country begins to solve its own problems, it also begins to expose something deeper. It shows that perhaps things could have been different all along. And that realization can be uncomfortable, not just for those outside, but even within. Because revolutions are not only resisted from the outside, sometimes they are questioned from within. Some ask, is this sustainable? Can water alone carry such a heavy burden? What happens if the system fails? And these are not small questions, because this revolution is built on flow. And if that flow is interrupted, everything is at risk. Fields could dry again. Confidence could collapse. Hope could turn back into fear. So now, Burkina Faso stands at a critical moment. Not at the beginning anymore, but not yet secure. The water is flowing. The land is responding. The people are rising. But the future is still being written. So the question becomes, can this quiet revolution of water truly protect a nation from returning to the past? Or is it standing on a fragile edge, where one disruption could change everything? Stay with me, because what comes next will reveal whether this transformation can endure or be tested beyond its limits. When water begins to flow, it does more than change the land. It changes people. Across Burkina Faso, something quiet but powerful is unfolding. It is not loud enough to dominate headlines. It is not dramatic enough to shock the world overnight. But for those living it, it is everything. In villages once defined by uncertainty, a new rhythm is emerging. Morning is no longer about checking the sky. It is about checking the fields. Farmers wake up with purpose. Children wake up in homes where food is no longer a question mark. Markets begin to carry something they had slowly lost: consistency. And consistency is the foundation of stability. Issa's life has changed in ways that cannot be measured only in harvests. Before, every season was a risk. Every decision was a gamble. Every day carried a quiet fear. Now, he walks his land differently. Not as a man waiting, but as a man managing. He knows when to plant. He knows when to irrigate. He knows when to expect results. And that shift from uncertainty to control is where true transformation begins. Because development is not just about building infrastructure. It is about restoring predictability to life. When people can predict tomorrow, they begin to build. They invest in their land. They invest in their homes. They invest in their children. And slowly, a nation begins to rebuild itself from the ground up. But the impact does not stop at the farm. As agricultural output increases, something else follows. Local markets grow stronger. Food becomes more accessible. Communities become less dependent on external supply chains. And with that comes something even more valuable than food: confidence. Confidence that the country can sustain itself. Confidence that solutions can come from within. Confidence that the future is not entirely out of their control. This is how dignity returns. Not through speeches, not through declarations, but through the simple, powerful act of being able to provide. A father feeding his family, a mother selling produce in the market, a community no longer waiting, but producing. Water has made that possible. But with every gain comes responsibility. Because this transformation is still young, the canals must be maintained. The systems must be protected. The expansion must be managed carefully. If neglected, the same land that is now green could return to dust, and the consequences would be heavier than before. Because once people experience stability, losing it feels even more painful. There are also deeper questions rising beneath the surface. Can this model scale across the entire country? Can every region access the same level of water control? Will the system withstand future climate pressures? These are not questions of doubt. They are questions of sustainability. Because a revolution is not defined by how it begins, but by whether it endures. And endurance requires more than vision. It requires discipline. It requires unity. It requires long-term commitment. Burkina Faso is no longer standing at the edge of possibility. It has stepped into reality. The land is responding. The people are adapting. The nation is beginning to breathe again. But the journey is far from over. Because rebuilding a country is not a single act. It is a continuous effort, tested over time. So now, the question is no longer whether water can change lives. The question is, can this new foundation hold strong as the nation builds everything else on top of it? Stay with me, because what comes next will reveal how this revolution is being tested beyond its borders and beyond expectations. As Burkina Faso's water revolution begins to take shape, its impact is no longer contained within fields and villages. It is being watched. Not because of conflict, not because of crisis, but because of what it represents. A nation choosing to solve its own problems in its own way. Across the Sahel, where drought and instability have long defined the landscape, this model raises a powerful possibility. What if survival does not have to depend on external rescue? What if resilience can be built from within? And what if water becomes the foundation of that resilience? Countries facing similar struggles are beginning to observe closely, because the challenge is not unique to Burkina Faso. Dry land, unpredictable climate, food insecurity, these are shared realities. But so far, solutions have often been temporary, reactive, incomplete. What makes this moment different is intention. Burkina Faso is not reacting to crisis. It is attempting to prevent it. And that shift from reaction to control is what gives this revolution its weight. But with attention comes pressure. Because when a nation begins to change its trajectory, expectations rise. Can this model expand beyond Bama? Can infrastructure keep up with ambition? Can governance support long-term management? These questions are not coming from doubt, but from the scale of what is being attempted. Because this is not just a project anymore. It is becoming a model. And models are tested. Tested by time. Tested by climate. Tested by the limits of human organization. Water may be flowing today, but maintaining that flow requires more than engineering. It requires coordination. It requires protection. It requires vision that does not fade after the first success. And perhaps the greatest challenge is this. Can a revolution built quietly, without noise, without spectacle, remain strong when the world begins to pay attention? Because attention can bring support, but it can also bring pressure. Burkina Faso now stands in a new position. No longer a country waiting, but a country being watched. And that leads us to the final question. Is this water revolution the beginning of lasting transformation, or the start of a test that will define the nation's future for generations? Stay with me, because the answer to that question may change how we understand strength, resilience, and true independence. In Burkina Faso today, water is no longer just water. It is memory. It is survival. It is dignity, flowing through the land. What began as a response to drought has become something much greater. A statement that a nation, no matter how challenged, can choose to stand. Not by waiting, not by asking, but by building. Through canals carved into dry earth, Burkina Faso is rewriting its story. From dependence to control. From uncertainty to planning. From survival to dignity. But revolutions are never finished. They are lived, day by day. Because the same water that brings life must be protected. The same system that creates stability must be sustained. And the same belief that lifts a nation must be carried forward by its people. There will be challenges ahead. Seasons will change. Pressure will come. Doubts will rise. And in those moments, the question will return. Was this truly a turning point? Or just a moment of hope? But perhaps the answer is already here. In the fields of Bama, where green now replaces dust. In the hands of farmers like Issa, who no longer wait for mercy from the sky. In the quiet confidence of a people beginning to trust their own strength again. Because real power is not always loud. Sometimes it flows, slowly, steadily, unstoppably. So let me ask you this. What would happen if every nation learned to control the very thing that sustains life? What would change if dignity was no longer negotiated, but built? If this story moved you, not just as news, but as a reminder of what people can become when they choose to rise, then carry it forward. Because the future of a nation is not written in speeches. It is written in the choices its people make and the rivers they decide to control. And in Burkina Faso, that future has already begun to flow.